Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps we'll make a start. My name's Tony Baumgartner. I'm a partner in the political risks team at Clyde Co. A very warm welcome to you this morning. It's pleasing to see so many faces here again. This is our 12th collaboration with Menas Associates, and we're delighted to have such interesting speakers here today. I have to say, I do feel a little bit like Alan Whitaker taking a trip through some very exotic places. We're now on to Kurdistan, and to introduce our speakers this morning, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Charles Gurdon of Menas Associates, who will no doubt give us the lowdown and the background of the speakers that we're going to hear from this morning. So, Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, a health warning. This is the first time I've spoken in public since mouth surgery and radiotherapy last year, so I hope you can understand me. My voice isn't back to what it was. In fact, my wife said that she married me for my voice. I think I'd be divorced by now. I should mention our thanks for Clyde Co. Normally there's an introduction to Clyde, so you've missed your opportunity, I think. But as you can see, Clyde is a very large and diverse company in the Middle East and also elsewhere, so I'd encourage you to get hold of them. And this is the team for Clyde Co. As far as our own advertisement is concerned, most of you will know about us. But for those of you who don't, I would suggest you go to our website. For over 20 or 25 years, we've now been working on above-ground, non-technical risk for oil companies and also for other clients. In addition to that, we also have, I think at the latest, we have about 14 or 15 publications, including Iraq Focus, which covers Kurdistan in quite a lot of detail. And I'm therefore delighted to introduce our two speakers. Alison Pargeter has been working with us for, I think it's 8 or 9 years, on both Iraq and also on Libya and elsewhere, and she's the author of Iraq Focus. In addition to that, she has a long and distinguished academic career as well. And I'm also very pleased to have Ian McIntosh here on the panel as well. Ian was a client of ours when he was country manager for Libya with Petro-Canada and Suncor. More recently, he has been the general manager for Western Zagros in Kurdistan for the last 3 or 4 years. He's now an independent consultant, and he'll be able to answer many of the oil and gas questions afterwards. We will be, Alison will be speaking for about half an hour to 40 minutes. She'll then be followed by Ian, who will speak for perhaps 10 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So over to Alison.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thanks everybody for coming. Well, I'd start off by saying it's certainly a very interesting time to be talking about the KRG. Until recently, there was a kind of sort of predictability about the situation in the region, certainly on the political front. The region was dominated by the two main ruling parties, the KDP and the PUK, who'd pretty much carved things up between them. The security situation was almost entirely stable, and the region seemed to be immune to the kind of terrorist attacks and Islamist militancy blighting other parts of the country. And although relations between Erbil and Baghdad were always fiery, there was even a sort of predictability about this, with disputes sort of flaring up, being half resolved and flaring up again. However, things have changed quite dramatically over the last few months, most notably since the parliamentary elections in September 2013. And what these elections did, basically, was to throw up a whole new political equation. And all of the parties in the region are currently trying to come to terms with this new equation, and it's going to alter how the region functions. Meanwhile, the crisis in Syria and the coming together of al-Qaeda-linked groups in Iraq and Syria has brought about a new and more challenging security environment. And at the same time, the KRG's striking of its pipeline deal with the Turks has taken relations between Erbil and Baghdad to a whole new level of tension. And it seems that the Kurds are sort of increasingly struggling with the anomaly of being a region and yet at the same time wanting to be part of the whole. So while we can say that the Kurdish region is definitely still much better off than the rest of Iraq, things are certainly becoming more challenging and more difficult to navigate for the Kurds. So what I'd really like to do today is just to look at some of these changes and what they might mean for the region and its future. Before we start, I think it's helpful to give a bit of background and a few key facts. As you know, the Kurdish region is divided into 3 governorates, Erbil, Suleymaniye and Duhok, and it has a population of around 5 million. I think it's important to remember about half of those are under the age of 20. Interestingly as well, the Iraqi cabinet this month issued a decision creating a number of new governorates, and among that Halabja was included, and there's a proposal to make Halabja a separate governorate. That is all still very vague. It still has to be agreed by the parliament, so we're not there yet, but it's something to bear in mind. Although the region is dominated by the Kurds, there are, of course, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Turkmen and Armenian minorities. And while most are Sunni Muslims, there are also Christians, Yazidis, Khagai and other communities. As we know, Erbil and Duhok are controlled by the KDP, the oldest Kurdish political party headed by President Masoud Barzani. And to this day, I think we can say the KDP still remains a traditional party, a tribal party, and that's by far still the strongest player in the region. Suleymaniye, meanwhile, is controlled by the PUK, headed by the ailing Iraqi president Jalal Talabani. And like the governor itself, is deemed to be more open, more progressive, more urban and less tribal. But I think we can see that both of these parties, although to differing degrees, really are dominated by the families that control them. And this has always been the case for the KDP, that's dominated by the Barzanis, but has increasingly become the case with the PUK, as the Talabani family has moved to take more control in recent years. But as for the political scene, as I said, it's long been dominated by the KDP and the PUK, that both led the struggle for independence against the former regime, and relations between these two parties have oscillated over the years. However, more recently, they have proved able to work together, although there are clearly serious tensions between them. Now, after the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, the Kurds moved to set up a democratic political system with a fully functioning parliament, and we can say they've certainly made huge strides in that respect. However, despite that, the political scene has remained dominated by the 2 main parties that struck a strategic agreement to share power. So for all the democratic institutions that have been set up, key decisions have still tended to be made and agreed between the 2 parties, between their politburos, and then effectively rubber-stamped by the parliament. And in fact, these 2 parties have dominated almost everything in the region for the last 3 years. However, over recent years, the KRG did develop a growing and increasingly powerful opposition, most notably Guran, or the Change Movement, that was established as a breakaway faction from the PUK in 2007. Headed by Nushawan Mustafa, this party sort of positioned itself as a moral judge of the government. It's campaigned on issues of corruption, on advocating for reform. And Guran's been able to make serious inroads into PUK-controlled areas. But as yet, it hasn't made any real dent in the KDP's constituency. At the same time, the region has an increasingly powerful Islamist opposition. Now, although these are still relatively minor players, these parties, like the Islamic Union of Kurdistan or Al-Jamaat al-Islamiyya, have become more credible forces over recent years, and they've campaigned on many of the same issues as Guran. So for many years, the political arena was a seemingly stable combination of the 2 main parties basically controlling things behind the scenes and with a vocal but sort of ring-fenced opposition. However, all of this has changed over the past few months, and the region seems to have been tripped up by a number of factors. Firstly, the absence of Jalal Talabani. Secondly, the election results of the elections of last September. And lastly, the ensuing struggle to form a new government. So if we look at Talabani's absence, well, as I'm sure you're aware, just over a year ago, the head of the PUK suffered from a major stroke that's left him incapacitated and absent from the political scene. In fact, we don't actually know the true state of his health, and this seems to be one of the best-kept secrets in the region. And even senior PUK members complained that they don't know what state he's in. And actually, all of this has prompted all sorts of rumours that he might, in fact, be dead. Whatever the truth of Talabani's condition, it's clear that he's in no state to return to the political scene anytime soon, if at all. And Talabani's absence seems to have left the PUK in complete disarray, partly because Talabani was such a political heavyweight that no one can quite fill his shoes. And for many, the PUK without Talabani at its helm is just unthinkable. Also, there's no obvious alternative in the party who could take over. There are 3 names currently in the running: Hero Talabani, Jalal Talabani's wife, former Prime Minister Barham Saleh, and Vice President Khosrat Rasool. And these 3 are all part of the current leadership council that was set up when Talabani became ill. But none of those figures has really enough support to stand out and take on the leadership role. The latest talk is that the party is now thinking of promoting Talabani's son Qabad forward, and there's all sorts of rumours that he might take over from his father. But even if he did, even he wouldn't be able to replace Talabani or fill his shoes. More importantly, Talabani's absence has brought to the fore a lot of the factions that are inside the PUK. And Talabani was somehow able to hold these factions together. And we've seen a lot of fighting over the past year between different parts of the party. Now, these differences are more sort of over clashes of personality, over control, rather than any real ideological difference, although some, such as Barham Saleh's current, are pushing for greater reform and modernisation. But these differences have become more apparent now than ever. You have different parts of the party issuing different contradictory statements, and it seems somehow as if the party has suddenly lost its centre. And it seems to be that it's going to take some time before the party can decide on a new leader. In fact, they still can't seem to even acknowledge that Jalal Talabani's time is over, partly out of respect for Talabani, but also because they fear any leadership battle could end up splitting the party. So although they're supposed to discuss it at the PUK's upcoming conference, I think it might well be swept back under the carpet. So the PUK is likely to continue in this disorganised, fragmented fashion, so much so that some Kurds are actually questioning whether the party has any future. And this clearly results in a lot of uncertainty as to the future of the Suleymaniye government. Now, the PUK's disarray goes some way to explain the next big game changer in Kurdish politics, the September parliamentary elections. As you can see, the results altered the complexion of Kurdish politics. Now, predictably enough, the KDP still retained its dominance, taking 38 out of the 111 seats. But the big shocker was that the PUK was knocked into third place by Goran, that came second. Even though Goran, ironically, had one less seat than it had in 2009, it still ended up with 24 seats, and with the PUK taking just 18. So Goran was suddenly catapulted into second place. And the other surprise was the Islamist parties that also did very well. They increased their seats, and they ended up with a combined total of 17, which is just one behind the PUK. Now, this new alignment of power is causing no end of problems for the region that's really still struggling to come to terms with this new political reality. Firstly, it's brought the old strategic alliance between the KDP and the PUK into question. Secondly, it's sparked a power struggle in Suleymaniye between Goran and the PUK. This has provoked some tension. There has even been a little bit of very limited violence in the region, and both of them are trying to assert themselves in Suleymaniye. And thirdly, it's turned the whole political balance in the region on its head. And all this is really coming to a head over the issue of how to form the new government. The KDP has entrusted Nejavan Barzani to form this government, but despite endless rounds of negotiations, they've so far failed to come up with any power-sharing formula that's acceptable to all. Now, it's true that there's a broad consensus that they all want a broad-based government, especially the KDP because it's keen to rule without any opposition, but also a broad-based government would enable the Kurds to act as one in the negotiations that will follow the next national elections. But actually working out the nuts and bolts of how to form such a government is proving really challenging. And this is mainly because Goran is insisting that the government should be formed on the basis of the election results, but the PUK is refusing. And the PUK insists that it should still be the second power in the region. And it's arguing this on the basis of the grounds that it still controls the security services in Suleymaniye, and because it's still the most important player in those Kurdish regions outside of KRG jurisdiction. So it really believes it should remain second player to the KDP. But in fact, all the parties are facing a serious challenge now, including the KDP. It may have won the elections, but it's really in a serious fix. Firstly, it can no longer rule in the way it used to. It's lost that certainty that was provided by the strategic alliance with the PUK. And this alliance, we should remember, became particularly advantageous to the KDP in latter years as the KDP gradually became weaker. And it enabled the KDP to dominate more of the region. Now the KDP has to share power with other players, including Guran, who is not going to be such an easy bedfellow as the PUK. Guran is insistent that it's going to push for reform from inside the government. And most importantly, it's still intent on returning the constitution back to the parliament in order for the whole political system to be changed. Guran's demanding that the powers of the president be watered down and that the whole system be moved to more of a parliamentary democracy. And this is something, incidentally, that the PUK has supported too in the past. Clearly, that would be a disaster for Barzani and for the KDP. So the KDP is not going to have such an easy ride, whatever happens. The KDP also has to decide who to make as the second power in the region and who to give what post to. And both parties, Guran and the PUK, are currently squabbling over who should have the Deputy Prime Minister's job. And this is proving really difficult. And the KD's problem is that it can't just abandon the PUK because of its historical relations and ties, but it can't ignore Guran either, as this would make it seem as though it was cheating the electorate. And at the same time, it has to ensure that it can keep all the big portfolios for itself. It's not going to give up on the Natural Resources Ministry, the Peshmerga Ministry, or other big files that it's going to want to keep. So really, I think the KDP is left trying to square an impossible circle. As for the PUK, as I said, it can't seem to psychologically digest its defeat, and it's demanding that the strategic alliance be upheld. And it knows that in order to retain any credibility with its supporters, it's got to hold on to some big government posts, including the Deputy Prime Minister's post. The local elections are approaching in the region in September, and the party's really fearing it's going to lose a lot to Guran there too. And it fears that it's being gradually knocked out of the picture, and that maybe this could be the beginning could mark its death knell. That's not to say we should write the PUK off. Far from it. It's still a strong player in the region, and it will likely recover in some fashion. But what with this current election crisis, or forming the government crisis, and the loss of Talabani, it's doing a lot of soul-searching and is really struggling at the moment. Guran is also having difficulties. Guran's intent on becoming the region's second power, it feels it should just step straight into the PUK's shoes. But it also poses challenges for Guran if this were to happen. If it's accepted into the government, then it inevitably has to water down its reform demands. But it's precisely these uncompromising demands that have brought it its success in the region. And as the PUK, which started out as a progressive party aimed at defending the poor, has become ever more mired in corruption, Guran's appeal has come from its tough stance on corruption and its pro-reformist stance. And at the same time, its grassroots are demanding that it can only join the government if it's sure it can act as a real force for change from within inside. So if it does become the second power, it's going to have to find a way to take part and to cooperate without selling out on its principles. As for the other players, as for the other smaller parties, the Islamist parties, they're desperate to get a seat at the table. But given that so many constituencies now have to be appeased, it's not clear whether there's going to be enough space, so they're all jostling for posts. And the end result of all of this has just been 4 months of deadlock and delay. So, given that this situation can't go on forever, what's going to happen? Well, it's really difficult to say. I think there are a number of possible scenarios, none of which are particularly appealing for all of the parties. Firstly, maybe they'll come to some agreement and they will create a broad-based consensus government, presumably with a large number of ministries. But the problem with this is that it's likely to be weak and possibly dysfunctional, as everything will be reduced to the lowest common denominator. The main parties will also face trouble from Guran in such a scenario that's going to do its best to push its reform agenda. And the KDP is going to end up significantly weakened, which it's not going to like. Second scenario, the KDP and the PUK just decide to go ahead and uphold their strategic alliance and form a majority government with some of the minorities. If they did that, however, there would be a popular outcry, feeling that Guran had been cheated. Guran may well act as a spoiler, and the PUK would find itself weaker than ever in relation to the KDP. Third scenario, the KDP forms a government with Guran. But if that happens, then Iran is going to be in an even stronger position to demand reform. But also, we shouldn't forget that in order to rule, Iran also needs the PUK, because the PUK is still ruling Sulaymaniyah, it is still in control of the security services, etc., etc. The PUK is also going to reject such a deal, and that could create trouble in Sulaymaniyah. And lastly, Iran will also reject such a deal. Iran has very close ties to the PUK. It also has them to Iran, but the stronger are the ties with the PUK. And it's not going to allow the PUK to be out of the equation. I think it was notable this month that Tehran invited both the KDP and the PUK to Iran to try to resolve the issue, and Iran was not invited, and it was furious at that. Next scenario, Iran could, I suppose, pull together with other Islamists and the PUK to form a majority government and to knock the KDP out. But the KDP would refuse, and this would risk dividing the region into two, and is the most unlikely of all the options. But really, none of these scenarios are acceptable to all the parties. And at the moment, it's really not clear how this is going to be resolved and who's going to back down first. I mean, I guess it could be that Iran might possibly agree to go into opposition to save the day. I think it's unlikely, and I also think they'll create mayhem if they go to the opposition. So we can see that the region is in a serious dilemma. And also the delay is causing other problems. The parliament's not functioning at the moment because the parties can't agree on a new head of parliament because it's all wrapped up into this power-sharing deal. So everything's on hold. The budget can't be passed. Banks are running out of money. And there's talk now that there's not enough money to pay state salaries because everything is so delayed. And of course, the situation is also turning ordinary Kurds off politics even more. But I think it's critical that the region get its act together as it's now facing sort of new and more challenging security challenges. So as I said earlier, after years of stability, the region is now facing new security challenges. Now, I don't want to overplay this, but I think these things are worth considering. Firstly, the crisis in Syria clearly has a big impact, most notably in the fact that 120,000 refugees have flooded into Iraq, most of them into the KRG. That's causing a security, economic, humanitarian challenge. However, there are also reports coming out that some Kurds are going to fight in Syria. According to a spokesman from the Religious Affairs Ministry, as of October last year, they estimate that some 160 Kurds have gone, 9 of whom have been killed. These were all young men between the ages of 16 and 25, and they came from both Erbil and Sulaymaniyah. However, the head of the KRG's intelligence directorate put the number at more like 300, although this did include some from Kirkuk. Some of those who have gone are reported to be fighting with the al-Nusra Front. Others are reported to have joined the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, ISIS. And it was even reported, actually, that some of them were caught fighting against Syrian Kurds on the side of ISIS. The danger for the KRG, of course, is that some of these individuals might return radicalized by their experience and turn their attentions to targets closer to home. And I think it was notable that there was a video statement released at the end of last year by ISIS, and it featured a Kurdish jihadist who was sitting in Syria who declared, quote, "With these guns we will return to Kurdistan and we will kill all the members of the KDP, PUK and security forces." Now, this may well be a case of bravado, but I think it probably still rings a warning bell. Then there's the issue of overspill from Iraq, other parts of Iraq. Clearly, Iraq and the Al-Anbar governorate in particular is facing a serious challenge at the moment from Islamic militants, including those linked to al-Qaeda. And the hooking up of militants in Syria and Iraq to form this ISIS is a major issue of concern. Although, of course, I would add here that what's going on in Al-Anbar at the moment is a bit more complex than a battle between al-Qaeda and the state. It's a three-way battle involving the state, Islamic militants, and Sunni tribal forces. And the Kurds themselves are fully aware of the complexities of this issue. And in fact, they've warned al-Maliki to distinguish between his battle against terrorism and his battle against the Sunnis. But al-Maliki is intent on conflating the two things. As for the impact of Islamic militants on the KRG, while the bombings against the security headquarters in Erbil in September 2013 were claimed by the ISIS that proclaimed it had carried out the attack, seemingly in response to support that Barzani was giving to Syrian Kurds who were fighting it out against the al-Nusra Front. And those arrested in relation to the attack were all Arabs from Mosul. So there is the potential for further attacks inside the region. The other issue, of course, is homegrown militants. Now, the region has traditionally had a problem with Islamic militancy, albeit a very small one, and this has always been focused mainly in Sulaymaniyah and particularly in Halabja. And the most important group to operate there was Ansar al-Islam, that was established in 2001 following a merger between two other groups. It had several hundred members, and it controlled a number of villages near to the border with Iran, where it imposed its rigid ideology on the local population. Now, this group was largely driven out by Kurdish and US forces in 2003 and was pushed across the border into Iran. And this led to a belief somehow that the region had dealt with the problem, and as if it was immune to the Islamic militancy that was flourishing elsewhere. However, there are clearly still pockets where this hardline Islamist ideology resonates. In December last year, there were 16 militants who were arrested in Sulaymaniyah on the suspicion of having links with Syrian jihadist networks. However, some of them are reported to have taken part in an attack against a police headquarters in Kirkuk. So we can say that the region is not immune from the problem. However, having said that, overall security-wise, I don't think we should get this out of proportion. The region is still under very tight security control. And while there's always the possibility of further bomb attacks and further attacks, I think things are unlikely to change dramatically, and we're unlikely to see any sustained violence. Now, the other big challenge facing the region, of course, is managing its ever-tense relationship with Baghdad. And this crisis between the two continues to drag on. And given the core demands of both sides, I don't think there's much prospect of improvement. As ever, the main issues are the resolution of Article 140 in the disputed areas, who pays for the Peshmerga forces. The Kurds want Baghdad to pay. Baghdad says it should come from the Kurdish share of the budget, and who has control over the energy sector. And I don't think there's likely to be any real movement on either side in any of these issues, but particularly on the Baghdad side now that the elections are approaching. Now, it's true that al-Maliki needs the Kurds on side, but actually yielding on any of these really big issues would seriously weaken his position among his own Shiite constituents, and also among the Sunnis, some of whom he's now managed to win over. And he needs those on board now more than ever. And I think for him that's more important than keeping the Kurds on his side right now. I think the bad news for the Kurds is that in the upcoming national elections, it's looking increasingly that this third term that al-Maliki wants so badly may not be that elusive after all. Now, until very recently, it really looked as though al-Maliki was on his way out. But all the indications are now is that he's suddenly regaining his popularity. And this is largely down to the crisis in Al-Anbar. It's given him a massive boost, and he's being seen once again as the strong man of Iraq who can act. He's being seen as the only individual capable of holding the country together in the face of such a challenge. He's winning over the Shiites by portraying himself as their protectors, and it's also brought significant Sunni forces over to his side, those Sunni forces who want to drive al-Qaeda out. Now, of course, a lot could change between now and April, when the elections are to be held. But if things carry on in this way, then it's likely that al-Maliki could receive the largest share of the vote, and Iraq could just find itself with al-Maliki at the helm once again. And I think we should remember, too, that the Kurdish position in the national context is likely to be weakened in the next elections because the Kurdish parties have decided to enter the elections separately rather than as a unified list. So as a force, they may well become weaker when it comes to working out how to carve up power afterwards, although they might well, of course, all come together again after the elections. But we still have the issue of Quran and whether it will stick with the others. So I think any real concessions that are going to be made by either side are probably going to wait till after the elections when the results are known. Then it may or it may not be that the Kurds will be the kingmakers, and only then are we going to know. And I think we should remember, too, that everyone said after the March 2010 elections that al-Maliki would have to make concessions to the Kurds in order to keep them on board. But instead of concessions, he just made promises that he didn't keep. And I don't think there's any reason to think it will be different this time around. So there doesn't seem to be much prospect of relations improving. And I think this includes over the energy issue. The recent pipeline deal, of course, has brought a whole new crisis to relations, and it really is too much for Baghdad to bear, and it feeds into real fears about Kurdish secession. that the Kurds' recent move to try to sell oil through Como rather than Somo was an added insult to Baghdad, especially because as far as Baghdad was concerned, all this had been agreed at a meeting in December with the Kurds and with Turkey to sell through Somo and for the revenues to go into a federal pot. And the Kurds are now declaring that they never agreed to any such thing. And they won't accept anything that doesn't see them have complete control over their exports and their revenues. And Nejivan Barzani said as much a couple of days ago. As I'm sure you're aware, Baghdad's responded by threatening to take legal action against the KRG, Turkey and IOCs. And it's also declared it will never deal with any firm that buys oil from the Kurds. More ominously for the Kurds, however, Baghdad is now threatening to cut their 17% share of the budget. In addition, they've included articles in the draft 2014 budget stipulating that the Kurds must export 400,000 barrels per day, a figure it can't really meet, and that Baghdad will deduct any shortfall in this amount from their 17%. The Kurds are refusing to agree to this budget, but that doesn't mean that it won't be passed. So yet again, the two sides are in angry deadlock, but the tensions seem higher than ever. And as ever, at the core of this problem is the ongoing issue that the Kurds want control over their energy sector, and they don't want to be forever in Baghdad's pockets. They want to be free to be able to sustain themselves economically, and this is something that feeds into their political aspirations too, to be taken seriously as a power in the international community. But of course, for Baghdad, this is always going to be unacceptable, as it threatens the unity of the country. It also frightens the government that other regions or governments might try to follow suit and do the same. Basra is currently calling to have a greater say over its own resources. Many governments are now demanding that they be given $5 per barrel of oil they produce as opposed to $1. So you're seeing an assertiveness amongst other regions. And of course, in the middle of all this is Turkey, stuck in the middle, trying to play to both sides, but its recent actions seem to have put it rather more firmly in the Kurdish camp, despite the fact that this is likely to result in further deterioration in the already antagonistic relations between Erdogan and al-Maliki. And Iraq is now threatening to boycott all Turkish companies. Now, Ankara is clearly hoping that this will all be resolved and that in the long term it will have made the correct strategic choice. But as things stand, it's unclear quite how this particular crisis is going to pan out. But I think Baghdad is unlikely to relent. It's too big a deal for al-Maliki to give way on, especially in the run-up to the elections. So if al-Maliki is successful in the elections, he may well move to strike some kind of deal with the Kurds to bring them on board afterwards. But I would say past experience suggests that any promises or concessions might not materialise. And I think we should remember too that these negotiations aren't only going to be about oil. We shouldn't forget that the Kurds are going to want other things from Baghdad. They're desperate to hold on to the presidency of Iraq, and they're desperate to take other key ministerial posts. Indeed, the Kurds really seem to want to have it both ways. They want to operate as an independent state when it suits them, but to be a fully fledged player at the national level too, which upsets many Iraqis. So I think it seems highly likely that this dispute will go on, and Baghdad will do everything in its power to stop the Kurds from exporting independently. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point of military action between the two, but I think Baghdad is likely to do all it can to strangle the KRG financially. As to the issue of Kurdish independence that keeps being talked about, I think this is still very much an aspiration, but I think we're still quite a long way off from that. I think we should remember that the Kurdish region itself is still fraught with its own problems. It isn't really even one region, it still acts as two separate administrations. So I think this is still something for the future. And I think we can say the same about the idea of Iraq breaking up into 3 regions. There's certainly a lot of talk about this, and there are certainly growing aspirations among elements within certain regions to go it alone, or certainly to have a greater autonomy. And it's seen by some as the most obvious way to resolve the deep-seated problems. But I think we should remember that set against that is there's still a very strong sentimental attachment to the idea of Iraq being one. And there's also the idea that breaking up the country is somehow a colonialist conspiracy aimed at weakening Iraq. And also, if it were to break up, there would always be the thorny problem of Baghdad. It's too mixed to fit either into a Sunni area or a Shiite area. The religious establishment is also strongly against Iraq breaking up, and there's a lot of Sunni tribes that are very nationalistic are also against it. So while I think there's certainly an appetite, or a growing appetite, for the idea of independence, especially among the Kurds, and it could indeed happen one day, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. And the last sort of big challenge at the moment as well, I think, the region has to face the changing demands of the population, many of whom are young and who have different expectations from the older generation. It's no longer acceptable for the big political parties to rely on the glories of the past, on their heritage of having led the struggle against the Ba'athist regime, as if that's somehow enough for them to rule unchecked. People are also increasingly fed up with the corruption that permeates the region to staggering proportions. It's true across all three governorates. This includes the fact it's impossible to get jobs or to progress or to get anything done unless one is a member of one of the two main parties. And in fact, supporting the opposition can still result in losing your job, or in some cases worse. There are still problems with unemployment, with infrastructure, and there's very real poverty. Although there has been a lot of progress in Erbil and some in Sulaymaniyah, Kurds often complain that this same progress is not being made elsewhere in the region, and Duhok is in a pretty dire situation. Underneath all of this is the fact that everything is still linked to the parties. So I think the political establishment really needs to weed out some of this corruption to reform itself if it's going to maintain the trust of the population and to build a really prosperous and democratic region. Whether they will be willing to do so or able is, of course, another matter. So to conclude, setting aside everything I've said, I think the KRG is, of course, still in a far better position than the rest of Iraq, and it has made huge strides since 2003. But it's facing a particularly challenging time, and it seems that the old certainties have suddenly gone and the new fissures are coming to the fore. And how the parties deal with this is going to be crucial to the region's future. We're not going to see chaos or breakdown as security remains strong, but on the political front, I think we're going to see some bumpy months ahead. I don't think we're going to see any real change in the attitude of Baghdad to Erbil and its energy policy either. So while overall, having said all that, I do think the optimism about the region is justified. We shouldn't deny the fact that the Kurds are determined to pull the region up. They're truly open to the world in a way that many other countries in the region are not, and they are really keen to develop and create a modern, prosperous state. But in light of all the sort of problems and challenges I've just discussed, I think that this optimism should perhaps be tempered with a bit of healthy caution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for those fascinating insights into the current political dynamic in the KRG. As Charles said, Ian is now going to share with us his own forensic experience. So, welcome, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. I found that very informative, and even though I'm working and living in Kurdistan, and I'm glad you ended up on a note of optimism, because at points there I was starting to get worried that I was misunderstanding this, this region that I very much adore working in. But I do agree with the statement that optimism is justified, and I will make mention of the fact that there is a little bit of risk of complacency within the industry, within the investment community, because we are not necessarily fully understanding the potential impact of the sort of changes, political changes, social changes that Alison alluded to. So I think that was a good reminder for me, certainly. My background, as mentioned, has been in oil and gas management, and I retired from Western Zagros a year ago, and to consult in the industry, and I'm consulting in Kurdistan and Libya, which are the two countries I most recently worked in. And I have to state a bias for really believing in what Kurdistan is trying to do. So if that comes through, that's I'm not going to apologise for that. I very much support this region and what they're aspiring to achieve. And that's also why I'm continuing to work in Kurdistan. I actually have a kind of foot in two camps now. I'm consulting in the industry still to a small degree, but my major project is as a consultant to the Ministry of Natural Resources in Kurdistan. And I'm working on a project to get more young Kurds into the oil and gas sector. That's not something I'm really qualified to do, but it's something I really believe in, and the industry needs to take leadership of that challenge. So I'm glad you mentioned at the end that this is something that the region really needs. Some observations from my few years in Kurdistan. So that was 3 years with Western Zagros, and I've now been a year consulting. For those of you who've been there, and well, for those of you who've been there once, you maybe don't see this, but those that have been there from time to time, the change that's taken place socially in the cities, and I differentiate the cities from rural Kurdistan, but the change that's evident in the cities is dramatic. Whether it's in number of new hotels or apartment buildings, and apartment buildings in which the apartments cost, you know, $300,000 to $500,000. We're not talking about affordable housing here, and even the expat lifestyle, the number of expats that are there, dramatic change. I mentioned to someone earlier that when I first went there 4 years ago, all the expats in Erbil could gather together in the one restaurant in an evening. And of course, that is just almost silly to think of now. Dramatic industry growth, of course. There are some 50 drilling rigs active in Kurdistan right now. 5 years ago, there were about 5. So, I mean, just an inordinate increase in activity. 4 years ago, when I went there, we had difficulty getting services. In other words, that was one of our biggest business risks in operating in Kurdistan, was just not being able to get the service companies to do the work. And again, that just seems such ancient history now. Kurdistan is also becoming a destination for service companies. There are some 1,250 oil field service companies registered with the ministry in Erbil now. So I don't know how that compares to other countries, but it must put it pretty much in the same league as most serious oil exploration development areas. A few words about the ministry. Again, those of you who are familiar with Kurdistan will know what tremendous job the Minister of Natural Resources has done in the last 7, 8 years since he's been there, and he deserves a lot of personal credit for what has been accomplished. The ministry, however, does come in for a little bit of criticism in terms of capacity, but even that is changing. And I guess, I mean, I'm an example of a resource that's been brought in to help build the capacity of the ministry. So that is changing, becoming more open, more consultative, issuing environmental guidelines that are being distributed to industry before they're being introduced. So, you know, impressive change. The industry itself, in terms of the companies there was a lot of fuss about Exxon's entry 2 years ago. Certainly there are a number of the majors there. The majors are still largely in exploration because they were latecomers, so the industry in terms of production development is still dominated by smaller and medium-sized companies. But there are becoming fewer operators there. There's already, I think there's only 24 now because of consolidation and becoming bigger, as I mentioned. And the thing I'll come back to again in a few minutes is that there is most definitely a shift in business risk. I mentioned, for example, the risk of getting services 5 years ago. I mean, that was a significant business risk at the time. Is it a riskier place to do business today? I think not. So I think part of the optimism is related to the fact that risk is reducing. But if you start to slice and dice that risk profile, certainly you can find certain risks are increasing and others are diminishing. But it's a changing risk profile overall for the better. The view then, you know, if you're on the ground in Erbil with an oil company, you could be forgiven for thinking Alison was talking about a different country there at times, because you can sometimes just not see some of the environmental, social and environmental changes that are taking place. But it is very much a positive environment, and people are very optimistic in the industry about how things are developing. there is a danger in the complacency setting in, as I said, particularly regarding the risk from, I would say, the geopolitical situation that Kurdistan finds itself in. What's going on 100 miles away from Erbil is a civil war in Syria, cities like Kirkuk and Mosul, which are extremely dangerous. And these are all, as I say, quite proximate to Kurdistan. So Kurdistan is a little oasis of calm, and is that because of the strength of the security forces. That you know, when they say there's 250 young Kurds working, fighting for ISIS in Syria, they know that, and they know that 9 of them have been killed, and they can give you their names. The security services are very effective in managing the situation, but it's becoming more complex. The industry is in early development now. I mean, there's a lot of exploration still going on. Almost all of those, all of the 50 contracts still have exploration active. So it's still very much an exploration area. But some 12 of the 24 operators have discoveries. So there are half of the operators now are in development, or development planning, I should say. There are really only 4 fields which are proven and developed. I mean, the 3 big oil fields and 1 gas field that has actually been produced for the last few years. Most of the others then are somewhat, you know, in waiting or being tentatively developed in an early development basis. One company that's with a major discovery really should be, you know, in any other area building, you know, 150,000 barrel a day facility, and it's ordering a 30,000 barrel a day facility with an option to order another one and then another one. So you can see that how the caution is manifesting itself in how companies are developing the discoveries that they have. So in terms of the risk profile, the number 1 risk in Kurdistan, even with the high success factor in exploration, is still the technical risk. And when I say technical risk, I mean the cost as well. The company I work for, Western Zagros, we really got into difficulty more than once with operations that ended up being so much more costly, so much more technically complex than we had ever envisaged. And it's not universal across Kurdistan, and the differences in technical challenges vary, but everyone, I think, is largely finding that it's a much more difficult area than what they had anticipated. But the exploration success has been high. So technical risk is probably still number 1. And the development of those resources is not straightforward. As many of you know, some of the discoveries, the biggest discovery is very heavy oil. That's yet to be proven exactly how easily it is to extract that oil. Oil in place, undeniable. The ability to extract it yet to be proven, really. Security risks, I'm not going to talk much more about the overall reasons for security risk, except to say again, my experience of 4 years has changed. The security situation has changed dramatically. I move around Erbil personally, you know, just using taxis. I have no security with me at all. 4 years ago, expats were very cautious, and you know, that is changing. Monetization, sorry, it's changing, but it's still significant because of the proximity of and potential of problems. Monetization, I guess, is still up there as a risk. The pipeline is to Turkey's installed. The ability to flow oil through that pipeline seems to have been demonstrated. We're not quite sure capacity because, as you know, it's not been fully tested. But physically, it's connected, and so physically the exports can take place. The issue is really in the revenue, and the issue from revenue relates to the political issues that Alison has well expressed. So those risks still prevail. The next one I want to talk about is something that gets in the newspapers from time to time, which is community risk. The aspirations of rural Kurdistan are not being met. In other words, you go to Erbil, you see 30 apartment buildings under construction. You go to a small town, you really see nothing. There's no evidence of much change. And that is, I think, a risk that the government and the oil companies are really not recognizing and not responding to well. And then when you get down to the village level, the expectations of an individual family to see some benefit from the oil and gas industry are extremely high. We were running an operation that, every truck that's going out that gate was $20,000 worth of oil in it, and for the local people, $20,000 is a sort of lifetime wealth. So they expect that to have some impact on them, and oil companies, I think, are being very slow to realise that they have to understand the frustrations, the concerns, the aspirations of the local community, and start to address those. Otherwise, there will be more confrontation. There was a confrontation 2 weeks ago. One of Chevron's operations, they had to withdraw their staff from the site because of threats that have been made with weapons against their staff. I don't know the full story, but I think there are reasons to understand why the people who came in there to protest came up to protest. It wasn't just they weren't just sort of ill-intended. There was genuine frustration there. So community risks are still very significant. Government risk emanates more from the issue between Erbil and Baghdad than it does from how the Kurdistan government treats the industry. The industry is still, the government is still very business supportive. The visas, for example, are readily come by. It's easy to bring in foreign workers, much to my chagrin, because I'm trying to lead a project to get more Kurds employed in the industry. So the fact that it's very easy for our companies to bring in foreign workers is not something I necessarily subscribe to, but it is easy to come and do business. Importation is easy as well. So a number of different risks that still have to be dealt with in Kurdistan, but some of them, like the government risk, definitely much better than 5 years ago. So, my advice to companies interested in doing business in Kurdistan is first of all to very much respect the government. It's very easy to criticize the government. It's very easy to point out where things are not working well in Kurdistan, but I believe that the government has done a remarkably good job of managing all the pressures on them, the geopolitical pressures, the internal pressures, managing these internal political differences, which can paint quite a dramatic picture, but at the end of the day, they're all Kurds, and those Kurdish parties are remarkably good at coming together in the face of the issues associated with either southern Iraq or other countries. So the government, I believe, has managed to weave a pretty effective path, and I think any company coming in has to be empathetic to that and not pick up on the things that they're not necessarily doing a good job of. Companies have to come in and honour the spirit of the PSCs. The PSCs, the contracts the oil companies have, are, I consider, a little bit immature, a little bit. They could be a bit more sophisticated in today's world, and the companies need to very much appreciate the privilege that they have in having a PSC in Kurdistan, because that is a contract in an area of opportunity. That's quite a rare thing in today's oil and gas world. Companies have to respect the community concerns, as I mentioned before. It's absolutely vital. And lastly, I see a lot of sort of dissonance in the way that companies treat risk. I constantly find companies not being consistent in addressing risk across the board. You come to work in Kurdistan, in Iraq, that is a business risk, and companies can come in, make that decision, and then come in and behave in very, very, very risk-averse ways once they're on the ground. And I find that rather inconsistent on their part, but I think also that reflects that the company is not really addressing the risks of business in Kurdistan, and those risks can largely be managed. So it's still an area in which those risks we have to be aware of, and we have to manage them. So to me, Kurdistan still represents maybe not a high risk, but a medium to high risk area for an oil and gas company. But it's also a medium high risk reward. Certainly the profit oil in the contracts has been squeezed a little bit as areas of or blocks have been de-risked. Then the minister has managed to reduce the profit that the operators will take from the development of those areas. So I'm not denying that that's getting eased back, but usually it's hand in hand with the de-risking that's taking place, either because they've been drilled or because they're a couple of exploration wells already drilled by another operator, perhaps. So it's still a balanced oil and gas province. So for those of you not familiar with Kurdistan, of course, it's much more illustrative to actually go to Erbil, and it's a much easier thing to do to just come to visit the area than it used to be. So I encourage you to do so, and I'd be happy to welcome you there if you make that journey. So thank you very much.
Thank you.